Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my great pleasure to meet with Jack Wilson and talk about his research into the Golden Horde of the late 13th century, a story of coups, conquests and gold. Jack is a historian of the Mongol Empire, having completed his MA at the Central European University, focusing on the Golden Horde Prince Nogai. He is currently working on his PhD, also at CEU here in Vienna. His doctoral research focuses on an intense period of instability in the Mongol-ruled Golden Horde of the late 13th century. Jack is also known for his work to make academic material on the Mongol Empire more accessible online, often for YouTube channels such as the Jackmeister, Mongol History, and Kings and Generals. Jack, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Karen.
You're very welcome. Now, it's well known the Mongol invasions of the 1240s were quickly followed by a retreat and, shortly after that, a breakup of the vast Mongol Empire. But you are researching later waves of invasions in the 1280s. As a bit of background, could you give us a brief outline of the politics and dynastic situation between the retreat in the 1240-1241 and the invasions of the 1280s?
I would be delighted. So you will often hear that the Mongol Empire broke into independent Khanates following the death of its founder, Genghis Khan, but more properly in Mongolian, Chinggis Khan, in 1227. Now, this is not what happens. In fact, the empire stays united and continues to expand to the death of his grandson and successor, Möngke Khan, who dies in 1259. Now, between that, you have a few Khans, and there are a bit of struggles around some of the successions, some prolonged regencies over the 1240s. And this means that the 1240s is a period of a bit of destabilization for the Mongols, a slowdown on the conquests. But then in the 1250s, you have a major coup, and Möngke Khan comes to power and sets on this process of reconsolidation of the empire and expanding the conquests. And you see huge new waves of invasions into China and into the Middle East. This is when you get the famous sack of Baghdad in 1258. But on Möngke's death in 1259, there is another succession struggle. And the result is princes across the empire have used the opportunity to cut out their own slices of the empire for themselves. And the northwestern portion, today's Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, this is ruled by the line of Jochi. And this is the Golden Horde. And in the 13th and 14th century, the main lineage ruling the Golden Horde, and the one that we will be talking about today, is the descendants of Batu, the second son of Jochi, and one of the main commanders in the initial invasion of Hungary and Poland in the 1240s.
Why was it called the Golden Horde?
This is a name that starts to appear associated with the Khanate in the 16th or 17th century Rus chronicles. But it is a word already in use in the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, as it refers to the palace or command tent of the Khan. At the same time, in Mongolic cultures, you have color and directional associations. So each of the cardinal directions has a color associated with it. So black is associated with the north, south with red, west with white, and east with blue, and the center with yellow or gold. And the center is also associated with the Great Khan himself, and gold is therefore often a stand-in for the imperial lineage, so the golden lineage. And we have a few structures referred to by eyewitness accounts as the Khan will be staying in his Golden Horde, his golden tent, because it is a large tent literally covered in gold, like gold leaf covering the posts within the tent. Or the Mongols really loved this type of weave of silk and gold that would be layered together, and they would just cover everything they had with it. The floors, carpets, and surfaces within the tent would be covered in it. So when you would walk up to it and go inside of it, it would literally look like everything is sort of shimmering and golden in front of you, and would be a very auspicious sight if you're just an envoy coming to the court of the Khan. So Golden Horde was probably already in use in some form as a way to refer to the imperial center.
I'm now just trying to imagine what it would be like seeing this golden tent with golden poles and golden floor. You'd feel in the presence of a god.
Well, it'd literally be the wealth of Asia. Their clothing would have precious stones sewn into it. They loved pearls in particular, and we see in some of these paintings that we have of the wives of the Khans, their headdresses would have layers of pearls coming down, hanging like down by their ears, and you would be shocked at the level of wealth. And that was the point, is that you're supposed to look at these people and be amazed at and immediately recognize these are the masters of the world here, and they are wearing the wealth of the world on themselves.
And silk itself is a wonderful, shiny textile, and that woven with gold. I mean,
well, this is one of an interesting thing, and a bit of a digression here, but the clothing of the elite and royal and imperial Mongols would be cut in the same fashion as your common Mongols. It's still the same design of the garment, except it's the material that changes. So it's almost something that a regular herder might have slipped on, except one of these garments is made out of felt and the other one is made out of riches and silk and gold. And it's sort of an interesting way that they approach the demonstration of wealth.
Yes, I think we could talk on this for a very long time. Fashion. Oh, yes. Moving on. Right. Going back to the politics and the dynasties, the empire broke up into 4 separate parts, one of which was the Golden Horde. What was the relationship between the parts of this empire?
Well, first of all, the relationships between these Khanites is generally very bad, and they're spending a lot of time at war, either huge-scale warfare or sort of small, sporadic border skirmishing. And as I have argued, part of the reason the Golden Horde does not engage in an immediate attack on Europe again for most of the 13th century is that the Golden Horde is more concerned about guarding its massive borders against its antagonistic cousins in Central Asia and in the Middle East. The Golden Horde's borders are stretching basically all the way to Mongolia. And there are periods of détente between these Khanites. There are periods where they are recognizing we are all descendants of Chinggis Khan. We should be putting aside our differences and uniting against the rest of the world. And then even in 1304, you have this great peace between all of the Khanites, and they all recognize the overlordship of the Great Khan again. And that lasts, I think, about 2 years before they start killing each other again.
You're saying that the Golden Horde was from Ukraine, the Russian steppes, through Kazakhstan and almost to Mongolia. And under Genghis Khan, it had been even bigger. How on earth did they manage to rule a place that big? How did they communicate with each other?
So this is something the Mongols put a tremendous amount of work into, is actually making sure that they have control over these far-flung regions. Now, a lot of people look at the Eurasian steppe zones as a nomad's land. people wandering wherever they please, these nomads. But that's not how steppe life works. The way it is organized is into a series of summer and winter pastures assigned to military units and their families. And they move in this sort of north to south pattern over the course of the year. So in summer, you tend to go north where it's cooler, and in winter, you tend to go south when it's going to be a bit warmer. So when the Mongols take control of most of the Eurasian steppe, they reinvigorate this system, so their people are getting the best pastures, are in control of these pastures, are collecting the taxes from the people on these pastures, and of course these taxes are assessed in kind, so in animals. So once this system is in place, the Mongols are also installing jam or yam routes across this expanse, which are messenger stations set up at regular intervals so that a messenger can ride across this distance, get to the next station, get on a fresh horse, get resupplied, and continue on his route. And this way the information, orders can also traverse over this huge distance. And importantly, the military threat that the Khan can raise against his vassals, against his enemies, is so immense that people aren't really willing to challenge that. If you're in the steppe or steppe adjacent, you are very exposed to the Khan's horsemen, and you don't really want to risk that if you don't have to. And one of the kind of remarkable things about the Mongol Empire is you see very few actual revolts against Mongol rule as sort of this recognition of the absolute monopoly on power that the great Khan and his allies have.
Was it a recognition of their monopoly of power, or were they just rather good at ruling vassal people?
Well, it depends on where you are living. One of the most notable revolts against Mongol rule happens in 1238, I believe. And it happens in Bukhara, in today's Uzbekistan. You have this quasi-popular revolt against Mongol rule, and it lasts up until the first battle. And the revolt is then put down quite harshly, and the Mongols have to get talked out of basically eradicating the settlement. And this fear at what might happen if you revolt and end up on the Mongol wrath, I think ends up outweighing the question of are they good or bad governors, because it doesn't matter when everyone knows what the punishment will be for deciding otherwise.
Yes, I take your point. Okay, moving on to your current research, which is more linked to the 1280s. You're talking there were further Mongol raids coming into Hungary, led by Nogai and Toliboka. Do you know if this was a planned invasion, or was it simply a raiding attack? Why did the Mongols leave so quickly?
So this is the 1285 second Mongol attack on Hungary. And it's a bit of a curious thing where it's one of these things where the sources, they all mostly agree on what happened and how it goes, and the outcome, which is that the Mongol army, while withdrawing over the Carpathian Mountains, gets caught in this horrific snowstorm, and the army gets absolutely annihilated. The Halych-Volhynian Chronicle says something like the Khan, Toliboka, he leaves the mountains with just a wife and a mare. So everyone agrees on all that part, but none of the sources are really saying why it's happening. And this is one of the goals of my current research, is to look at the why. And there's been a few theories before in the scholarship. A popular but inaccurate one is that Nogai and Toliboka are coming into Hungary to prop up the king at the time, the Laszlo IV, who was a very unpopular monarch. And some people have accepted this uncritically, but it seems like this is essentially just slander. But it will still appear in some of the modern literature. What it looks like to me is that this invasion is kind of coming out of a political mess that is happening in the Golden Horde at this time. First off, it appears from the Mongolian sources that the Mongols actually had a relatively high opinion of the Hungarian defense ability. Now, attacks continue on Lithuania, Poland, in southeastern Europe in the decades between 1240 and the end of the 13th century. And it seems like the Mongols are a lot more confident attacking this. These areas are weaker. We see a steady expansion of Mongol territory along the lower Danube. But we only really have this one other attack on Hungary. Now, I think you have kind of these factors together. You have Hungary is a bit of trouble to deal with. You have the Golden Hordes a bit concerned of all of its borders. What changes in the 1280s, you have, first of all, detente between the Mongols themselves. And there's a bit of peace between the various Khanates. It doesn't last long, but it is there for some of the 1280s. So it's a bit more comfortable putting troops to this western frontier. Hungary in this period goes through a lot of trouble with its king, László, and this revolt amongst the Cumans that happens in 1282. And a lot of them end up fleeing into the Golden Horde. And László actually pursues them into Golden Horde territory. And this trespassing, as has been argued by historians like Roman Hautala, probably served as like the immediate casus belli for the war. But I am arguing that internally in the Golden Horde too, you have this kind of crisis happening with the reigning Khan, Tödömönke, who is Khan from 1280 or 1282 to 1287. It's not clear exactly when he starts, but that kind of range. And he starts off as this kind of competent guy who increasingly, we have sort of two varying accounts of what happens. The more positive account that comes from Mamluk Egypt is that he becomes this kind of religious hermit who ignores his duties as Khan to enter this Islamic asceticism and leaves the actual running of government to his brother's widow, Jija Khatun. In the less positive account, Tödömönke goes what could be charitably described as insane. The general image is you have people trying to spin it in a positive way, and then you get the version the Mongols thought was a lot funnier, which was he's absolutely lost it. The point is he was shirking his duties as Khan and seen as incapable of running the government. Now within this, you have a nephew of Tödömönke named Tolobukha. Now this is a young guy. He's probably only in his early 20s, and he's very ambitious. He's going, hey, I think with my uncle kind of losing his mind here, this is a good chance for me to replace him to be the next guy in control. However, Tolobukha Han, he has no military experience as far as we can see. And this is very bad if you want to be Khan, because you want to show you're a man's man, that you have heaven on your side, that you've won a bunch of victories and you've done all these heroic things. But like I said, he's only in his early 20s. He's probably not had a chance to partake in any warfare. By this point, it's 40 years since the last invasion of Hungary. And these stories of the Hungarians' ability to resist the Mongols are maybe not really sticking with him very much. So my argument is that Tolobukha, he's seeing an opportunity here to go, hey, I could kind of compare myself to my great ancestor Batu Han by going into Hungary and scoring a nice victory there. And I don't think the aim was conquest. It does not seem to have really been properly organized for that, because it looks like this is happening without the Khan's authority, right? So it's probably the personal forces at Tolobukha, some like-minded princes, some of his close relations, as well as the prince Nogai can raise. Now, Nogai is a very important figure in the Golden Horde in this period. You will see in a lot of literature, he's this kind of all-powerful Khan maker who's appointing and deposing Khans of the Golden Horde. And this is something I have argued against, that this is a really blown-up interpretation of him that is created by the modern secondary literature. The primary sources tend to give him a lot more of a humble role. But important for our story, Nogai is governing the Golden Horde's most western territories, what is today Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova. So when these princes want to enter Hungary, they're going to call on his troops just because they're the most convenient ones to call up. So in my opinion, the attack on Hungary in 1285, it's not intended to conquer anything. The point is to basically score a bunch of booty, to make Tolobuca look good and get him some sort of success that he can come back to the Golden Horde and play up as a great and glorious thing. Look what I have done. Look at these treasures and slaves. And it actually looks like at the start of this campaign, the Mongols are relatively successful. There does not appear to be any great battle with the Hungarian king, Laszlo. There is a lot of local resistance, which gives the Mongols a bit of trouble, but the armies appear to make it as far west as Pest. But it's not anywhere near on the scale of the attack of 1241. They don't really look like they've brought any siege equipment with them, so they're not trying to take cities. They're attacking unfortified locations, villages, and when they start to withdraw, and early in 1286, they are explicitly described as withdrawing with wagons full of loot and prisoners. Now, I don't think if they were running for their lives to get out of Hungary, they would be doing so at a kind of leisurely pace with all of these nice treasures with them. And what ends up happening as they enter Transylvania and try and cross over the Carpathian Mountains is there are a lot of attacks on the Mongol forces by local troops. And the Mongol forces are getting ambushed as they're trying to leave, and a lot of the prisoners get freed, a lot of the loot gets kind of taken back. And then while they're trying to cross the Carpathians, Tolobuca's army gets trapped in a horrific snowstorm and suffers huge losses. Probably for the Mongols, they're interpreting this as some sort of intervention by heaven, right? The shamans associated with them are going to be reading that as negative signs. These are signs of the displeasure of heaven. And the fallout from this campaign is twofold. One, it starts to really sour the relation between Tolobuca and Nogai, because Nogai's forces, they cut south and seem to get out mostly unscathed. And Tolobuca, he's really angry that, hey, why is this Nogai guy going through here fine, but I suffered all of my loss? But it also, I think, starts to polarize and worsen the political situation in the Golden Horde, because I think Tolobuca loses his legitimate way to replace his uncle, because he has been so humiliated with the outcome of this campaign. This was supposed to build his reputation, and the end result was everyone in Western Eurasia knows he lost an army in the Carpathians. This is literally showing up in sources from across the Mediterranean. And the result is Tolobuca starts conspiring with some other princes, and they depose the uncle Tördemenke Khan in 1287. And exactly what happens to him is unclear. The version that gets sent to the Mongols' allies in Egypt, you can't say to your ally, hey, we just murdered our Muslim Khan. You have to spin that a nice way and go, oh, he willingly abdicated the throne to become a religious hermit. That's the version that appears in the Mamluk sources. That's the more positive version. The version appearing in the other Mongolian ones is the one where he goes insane and gets deposed by Tolobuca Khan and a group of allies. Which one is exactly true, I don't know, but I think kind of these varying versions are a bit fun to look at and compare.
Yeah, I could imagine that. So what happened after that? I mean, Tolobuca ended up looking remarkably stupid and incompetent, and yet a few years later, there he is, replacing the Islamic Khan. What happened?
Well, he calls upon a lot of princes who Tördemenke many years before had exiled. And he goes, would you guys like to get your chance at revenge? And they go, yes, sir, we would like that very much.
Aha, so he was a better man manager than he was a better army man.
I think he was just very good at finding grudges people had. And Tolobuka is kind of dividing up the territory of the Golden Horde between these princes, where this was probably part of the agreement where, hey, you help me get rid of my uncle, and I'll give each of you main guys kind of, become a governor of this region. And so this is 1287 that this happens, the year after the withdrawal from Hungary. And then later that same year, we get the attack on Poland. And what I think this is Tolobuka Khan going, all right, now that I've sort of set up things at home, I have to finally win a victory here and make myself look good. And the Mongols, they're going, I think we've been successful there twice already. I think on the third time we'll also be pretty successful. What's the worst that could happen? And it's not an outright disaster like the Hungarian campaign was, but it's not a big success. And that's what he was looking for. And later that year, he attacks the Ilkhanate to the south. And then that does so again in 1291, or 1290. And this is the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde both claimed this territory in the Caucasus Mountains. The Golden Horde claimed it first, but then in the 1260s, the Ilkhanate just took it. So the Khans of the Golden Horde will periodically try and retake this territory. And it looks like Tolobuka went, hey, I kind of got my hand burnt in Hungary and Poland and Europe there, but I bet I could really make my name by getting a hold of this territory that rightfully belongs to us. And as you might guess by now, he fails there as well, because everything this man does was essentially a bunch of failures stacked up on each other. But an important part of this is the overconfidence of Tolobuka in particular, is that these are all guys who are descendants of Genghis Khan, who all believe the world has been granted to them by eternal blue heaven. Every single one of these guys is going to be this incredibly kind of cocky commander once you put him at the head of an army, because he believes he's from a lineage of great conquerors blessed by heaven itself. They kind of imagine that they cannot possibly lose. And I think this is really some of the disasters of the Hungary and Poland and that this has on young Tolobuka. This is a guy trying to build his reputation and immediately failing.
And again.
And again, and again. All of the military actions we see him doing over this period all end in failures.
Moving on, I know part of your thesis is looking at climate, which you believe is changing over this period. And you're suggesting that this climate change had an impact on the Golden Horde. Can you explain a bit more about it?
So what appears to be happening, inferred from both some of the paleoclimatic data and also some of the sources, is that the Golden Horde is really experiencing a drought in its steppe territories. And in the Mongol worldview, they are going to be interpreting this as the displeasure of heaven. So beneficial environmental conditions, so warm and wet usually, which induce better grass production, are seen as heaven is expressing its favor. On the flip side of that, when heaven is displeased, this is going to manifest in a less beneficial climate, so droughts, storms, extra long and cold winters, locust plagues, you name it. And heaven's pleasure manifests, of course, in military victories. So, of course, during the Mongols' rise to power, it's very easy to say, wow, look how much heaven loves us because we are conquering all of this territory. And Mongolia, in the first quarter of the 13th century, goes through this unusually warm and wet period, coinciding with the establishment of the Mongol Empire. Now, there's practical benefits for that, but it also has kind of this ideological spin that the Mongols must have been making, where they're going, hey, Genghis Khan has declared this new empire, and heaven is so happy with it. Not only is he winning all of these victories, but the actual climate itself has become nicer as a result of it. Life is easier because the right guy is in control, a guy chosen by heaven. things start to become harder for people as this climate gets a little harsher. There's appears to be drought, animals are weaker, just putting a lot of stresses, a lot of angry people. And like I said, the Khans are collecting their taxes in these livestock. This is literally harming the revenues of the government. Maybe part of the reason for some of these attacks on Hungary is going, hey, let's just try and get as many sheep as we can to stock up on our losses here. But if this is happening at the same time as you have this really inept Khan, Töremenke, who is rejecting his duties as Khan to go into this hermitage or whatever. And the Mongols, and Tolobuka in particular, I think, are tying these two things together. Things are getting drier, things are not as nice here, and we got a real idiot in charge. And I think the attack on Hungary is kind of coming out of this, where there is a practical side, like I said, half in jest, let's capture more sheep. But also going, hey, we need a new guy in charge, because the current guy, he's not just a bad monarch, heaven hates him.
But then heaven didn't like Telibuka because he failed time and time again. Yeah, they've got a problem.
And this is, I think, manifests very clearly with what ends up happening to Tolibuka. So you have, after the last of his failures on the Ilkhanate, he starts to kill the guys he sees as potentially conspiring against him. Now, maybe they actually were at that point, or maybe they were just kind of whispers about it. And Tolibuka was going, look, it's clear everyone hates me. I better knock out the guys who can be the biggest potential threats to me. And this manifests as Nogai, his former ally, but who Tolibuka has blamed for the disasters in Hungary and Poland, and a cousin of his named Toktoa, who is another prince descended from Batu Khan, and Toktoa is singled out as a potential threat. And Toktoa hears of this, and he goes to Nogai and goes, hey, you and me, we gotta cooperate against this Tolibuka guy. He's gunning for us. There's these kind of lovely anecdotes that appear in some of the sources where Nogai, he pulls the wool over Tolibuka's eyes through a number of schemes, and the most memorable is that Nogai announces, I'm dying. I want to make amends. And he invites Tolibuka and the princes to come and see him. And so they come into Nogai's tent, and they see Nogai lying there, coughing up blood clots that he had just swallowed to dramatically cough up in front of them. And he's saying to them, I am just an old man on my last breath. While you are still young, put aside these troubles and, make amends. These are your cousins, your brothers. You are all descendants of Chinggis Khan. And while this is happening, Toktoa is marching up with an army to surround the camp. And Tolibuka and his buddies, they walk out of Nogai's tent and see a bunch of horsemen standing around them with spears pointed at their heads. And so at some point in 1291, Tolibuka and all of his allies and a whole lot of princes end up on the chopping block.
Yes, that's getting your revenge in early.
Tolibuka's reign is a period, 4 years of failure. These failed campaigns, the failure to confirm he has heaven's mandate, and failure to do anything to address these environmental shifts. Obviously, it doesn't matter how many victories he would have won, he's not going to change what's happening with the drought, but he can't make it look like he's really doing anything successful about it. And a big deal of rulership in the Middle Ages, ancient world, and today is you got to look like you're doing something, and that almost matters a lot more than actually doing something.
Yes.
And Tolibuka failed to make it look like he was doing anything successful.
Interesting point. For my final question, Jack, you mentioned something earlier about the length of the Mongol Empire. But from a layman's perspective, from the 14th century, the Mongols and their empire seem to have disappeared. This is very unlikely because it was a big population. What happened to them?
So this is a very interesting question. A lot of people have written a lot about. Roivan Amatai just released an a chapter on this. It's called something like "Where Have All the Mongols Gone?" in a recent volume by Anne Dunlop. But sort of the key points, and these are things Amitai suggests in his paper here, the actual population of quote-unquote ethnic Mongols, so people who are Mongolian and speaking a Mongolic language, was in the 13th century probably in the area of about 1 million people. This is a number that grows as you have more people who kind of get brought into the fold and maybe pick up Mongolian to kind of incorporate themselves into this union. But also most of the Mongol army, basically from the outset, is made up of non-Mongols. You have Mongols kind of overrepresented in the army center, but most of the army doing the fighting at any one time are various other Turkic-speaking nomads, huge numbers of Chinese-speaking peoples. And this is kind of the pattern across the Mongol Empire. And in the Golden Horde in particular, one of the sources, Rashid ad-Din, where he lists off the Mongols who have gone to the west. And I think the number, it's like 4,000 soldiers, and like including their families probably is bringing you to about 10,000 people. It's a very small amount of people who are what we would consider ethnically Mongolian. And of course, there's the whole issue of determining ethnicity and language and everything from 800 years later. But Mongolian itself retains this really high status place in the court of succeeding dynasties wanting to associate themselves with the Mongols. So we have, for example, Mongolian documents continuing to be produced in Iran, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, as late as the 1350s. We have in Anatolia a tetraglot glossary, which has it's a glossary between 4 languages produced in 15th century Anatolia. So you have Arabic, Persian, early Ottoman Turkish, and Mongolian. You have in Yemen in the 1360s what's called the Rasulid hexaglot. So again, it's like a dictionary glossary in 6 languages: Armenian, Persian, Arabic, Greek, Turkic, and Mongolian. So even as the Mongol Empire is increasingly breaking up over the 14th century, Mongolian itself is not disappearing, and you're still seeing some of these works produced in Mongolian. So in the short answer would be, there's not really that many Mongols in the West, and they kind of get spread out over what's probably a huge area. And outside of the court, Mongolian is increasingly disappearing, or maybe not disappearing, but falling out of use.
As you were talking, I am just thinking the Roman Empire kept Latin, and Latin was used right up until the 18th century.
I think this is also speaking to the different views of these empires, because the Mongol Empire is viewed as basically the shared property of the line of Chinggis Khan. To be a Mongol is, there's 3 ways the Mongols are framing it. But the most important one for them is this recognition of the supremacy of the Chinggisids, and speaking Mongolian is kind of actually secondary to that. That's only part of being Mongolian. And you compare this to Romanness, or what it means to be Roman. You can become a Roman citizen and become a Roman in a way that is different from becoming a Mongol. The Romans, this is the way they conceive the purpose and the point of the empire is differently from the Mongol one. For the Romans, there's no one family ruling the Roman Empire. It's not just one dynasty. It's
That's true.
Succeeding dynasties.
Yeah.
So the empire is kind of actually maybe distinct from these ethnic or dynastic or even linguistic elements. The Roman Empire exists as its own thing, versus the Mongol Empire is so intrinsically tied to the house of Chinggis Khan, you cannot have a non-Chinggisid ruling it and still be the Mongol Empire. And this is something that happens over the 14th centuries when the Chinggisids are losing power. You have powerful warlords like Tamerlane who are keeping puppet khans around because their followers will not accept them as rulers, because the followers still believe the world is rightfully in the hands of the descendants of Genghis Khan.
So I guess the lesson there is if you want to have a very long-term empire, have it as the empire and the dynasties slightly separate.
Yeah, for those of you building empires at home, these are things.
Oh, yes. Oh, and Jack, on that interesting point, we must leave it there. Thank you so much for coming in to the MECERN podcast and talking to us about your work on the Mongol Empire. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've learned so much today.
Well, thank you for having me. It was tremendous fun.
I'm glad. Thank you. Today I have been talking to Jack Wilson about his research into the Golden Horde in the late 13th century, a story of coups, conquests and gold. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting and enjoyable as I did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which MECERN members and associates talk about their recent or current research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you would like to talk about it to MECERN, please do contact me through the MECERN board or website administrator. I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.